Hi class, this is and today in business law and P1. Decided to do in this beautiful Box Hill. Box Hill is in Surrey and it is not too far off the A217 if you're coming from Croydon. And one of the nice places in Box Hill, it is this beautiful little stream, which I'll show you more of this stream later. So, we're doing P1 and P1 says explain the different sources of law and laws that organisations must comply with. So the first thing we must do in any question is to break the question down. So the question says explain the sources of law and laws that organisations must comply with. So the first thing we need to do is to identify the key words. The key word here is to explain, and explain means to go into more detail. So once we've identified that, then we need to look at the question. And the question says, explain the sources of law. So we need to identify the different sources of law. Then the second part of the question says, and laws that organisations must comply with. So before we find different laws to give an examples that organisations must comply with, we need to really break down the different types of organisations. So we're going to look at this question in three stages. We're going to look firstly at the different sources of law. Secondly, we're going to look at the different types of organisations. And thirdly, we're going to look at some examples of laws that organisations must comply with. So the first thing is this. What are the different sources of law? Well, the first source of law is going to be legislation. Well, what is legislation? Legislation are the laws that the government actually passes. The laws that the government passes that goes through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which we are going to look and go into more detail in terms of the process in terms of question P2. So when legislation is actually made, what actually happens is a bill is raised, and there are a variety of different types of bills that can be put forward. There is a public bill, there is a private member's bill, there is a private bill, and a hybrid bill. So if we are looking at a public bill. Public bills are bills which are put forward by the front bench of the cabinet. So, for instance, Theresa May is in power at the moment, and she has her front bench, and those front bench for the MPs who govern the country. And then she has her backbenchers. So the public bills are put forward by bills from her front bench. And that normally is put forward in terms of a white paper in terms of what the bill is all about, the proposal and the details of it, so that people can actually have a look at it and give their comments and so on and so forth. Then there is a private member's bill. A private member's bill are bills, again, which can be put forward by the backbench from the House of Commons and MPs from the House of Lords. Then we have a private member's bill. Now these bills are really, these bills and the idea behind them are put forward by organisations and pressure groups and different people outside Parliament, who then request that their MPs put forward these bills on their behalf. So these are put forward on behalf of certain groups and organisations. And hybrid bills are when a variety of different bills can come together. So if we look at the high speed rail bill is a hybrid bill, but that's come as a combination of two bills together. That's come as a combination as the Channel Tunnel bills in the 70s and 80s and the Crossrail bill in 2008. And then we can see that those bills have come together to make this hybrid bill. So we have legislation which goes through the Houses of Parliament, and it will go through the Houses of Commons and the House of Lords. There will be a first reading, second reading, committee stage, report stage, third reading, then it would go through the same process in terms of the other house, followed by amendments, followed by a royal assent. So that type of legislation we're looking at is predominantly known as primary legislation. Now, there is also secondary legislation. Now, when we look at secondary legislation, what we are in effect talking about are legislation that have been given powers, for instance, to local councils. Local councils can then actually go and implement law and legislation without having to go through Parliament in their bylaws. So some councils, for instance, in Sutton will say that you can, in their dumping, you can only dump one bag before you have to pay. But that doesn't necessarily apply to all councils. There are special regulations and laws when it comes to the Church of England and churches, which gives them power in terms of the reorganisation within their own structures. There are powers in terms of given to groups who may protest and want to put their petitions against certain bills that have come through in terms of primary legislation, and they have the ability to do that. And then there are other powers given to the House of Parliament to actually implement hybrid bills without it having to go through the same process again in terms of primary legislation for the House of Commons and for the House of Lords. So when you're explaining legislation, you really need to explain a little bit in more detail what primary legislation is in terms of going through the House of Commons and Parliament, but not too much detail in terms of the process, because we will go on to that in P2. And then you need to talk about the public bill, you need to talk about a private member's bill, you need to talk about a private bill and a hybrid bill, and maybe give some examples. And then some examples of main bills: Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, the Firearms Act, let's have a look, the Consumer Rights Act, 1st of October 2015. So these are legislation that's gone through the Houses of Parliament. Dangerous Dogs Act, and so on and so forth. So give some examples. And then talk about secondary legislation as well. And talk about secondary legislation and what this legislation is, and give some examples. Now, all the links for these are on the online class at classroom.google.com. That is classroom.google.com, and if I've invited you in, then you'll have access to that. Now, that's one source of law. Then there are other sources of law. Now, another source of law is common law. Now, in Europe, predominantly, there will be two laws that exist, either common law or civil law. Oh, by the way, it's really, really nice here. But it's so fresh and refreshing. I love the water coming down my legs, past my legs. Okay, so you've got common law. Now, common law is really based on the laws which are made from cases which have been brought forward to a judge, and a judge decides the law in that respect. In direct comparison with civil law is where there is a body of rules and regulations which have been laid down by professionals and experts, and then the judge, when the case actually comes to his attention, will then apply and interpret those rules and regulations in relation to that case. Okay, so we can see it from that perspective. Now, so that's the common law, and there'll be many cases in terms of common law. If we look at Donahue versus Stevenson, 1932, which established a principle of negligence without there having to be a contract between two people, which again we will go into more detail in terms of P2. And various other examples: Carlisle versus Carbolic Smoke Company, Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain versus Boots, Fenhouse versus Bingley, and so on and so forth. There's thousands of cases in terms of common law. Okay, so and then you have EU law. Now, EU law, obviously we're part of the EU, and as the UK is part of the EU, we have to abide by the laws of the EU. And the EU law is important from two perspectives: in terms of supremacy, that their law from the Europe takes over the laws from a national perspective. So wherever the law is from the EU, that will take over from the national perspective. And the second thing is the in terms of direct effect. The direct effect means that, you know, it is enforceable in a court of law, in a European court of law. So again, there is teeth to actually make sure that this is enforced, and countries can be fined if they're not adhering to this law and this legislation. So we've looked at legislation, which includes primary and secondary legislation. We've looked at common law as opposed to civil law, and give some examples of common law. Common law is, again, is laws that cases have been brought to the judge, and a judge decides on what the outcome is on that particular case, and that can decide things for the future, as in the case of Donahue versus Stevenson, 1932, which established negligence without there having to be a contract between two people. And then EU law. So again, to get more information on this, all the links are actually on the online class, classroom.google.com. So that's only the first half of the question, because the part of the question says, explain the sources of law. So when you're explaining the sources of law, explain the sources of law and explain what it is, and give one example at least for that source of law. So the sources of law being legislation, which includes primary legislation, secondary legislation, then the